Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you to another edition of Books and Looks. Yes, it's our weekly voyage discovery in the wonderful, wonderful world of books. Books that I've read and authors that I've interviewed. Today, we're talking to the author Janet Sherlund about her new book, Abandoned at Birth. Now, you have to understand this is a book about adoption. It's a topic and a subject that some people are not comfortable with. But Janet is here to explain her story because it's basically her memoir and the difficulties she had, the downside of adoption, because she feels there are downsides in all adoptions. And it's a fascinating, fascinating interview. Very thoughtfully done. Janet is my age. Okay. She's no young girl. She's looking for her mom, her birth mother, and she never finds her till she's 61 years old. Never finds the woman. It's a fascinating story about how she felt growing up as an adopted child, her siblings, because she came from a family with four adopted children, how she found her mother, her father, those siblings. It's a wonderful story and an interesting discussion we're going to have. I think it's something we all want to pay attention to because the stigma of adoption is not there like it used to be. When she was born in the 1950s, it was one thing, but it's still not an open adoption in our country. 10 states have open adoptions, 40 don't. So it's a very interesting situation here we have, and I think you're going to really enjoy it. So let's go right to that interview with Janet Sherland. Janet, welcome to Books and Looks.
Oh, I'm pleased to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we're happy you could make it. We know you're out in Phoenix because your one son has an operation, and you're out there giving him support and love and care. And best of luck to him, and hope he comes through okay.
Thanks. Yes, he's doing well.
Good, good, and hurry up to get back to the East Coast because it's a lot nicer weather.
I know, yeah, I'm a little warm out here.
It's 68 degrees here in Greenville, South Carolina today. I can't believe this because it's
Oh my,
a little chilly.
yeah, that is for South
Oh,
Carolina. Sure.
yeah. Anyway, hey, listen, before we get into talking about your book, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, your education, because you have a very extensive education, and whether you took any creative writing classes or any writing classes whatsoever.
Well, I was adopted at birth, which was probably the most significant factor of my life, and I grew up in Mountain Lakes, New Jersey, with three other siblings, all adopted as well. I always loved to write. I wrote even as a little kid. I wrote what I called books. Scribbled them out on yellow pads of paper and turned a lot of them into my teachers to read. I'm sure they were illegible. And then I did major in literature and fine arts at Colgate University, where I graduated with my degree. And I did take a writing class when my husband and I moved to Los Angeles after college for his job. And I did take a writing course there that lasted a couple of months, and I enjoyed that very much. And otherwise, that was the only professional quote unquote training that I had in writing. But I've just loved to write my whole life. Just wrote anything and everything, and was a voracious reader.
Hmm. Now, you didn't say you went to Skidmore. I think you were there for a couple years.
I did transfer a couple times. So I actually started out at Dartmouth when they were first
Oh,
admitting women. And then I went to Skidmore because I wanted to be a fine arts major. And so I did that for 2 years, but wasn't really happy there. So wanted to then focus on literature and went to Colgate University, transferred to Colgate University for my last 2 years. So I ended up with a double major in art and literature, but my degree is from Colgate.
okay. I thought you were a big fan of horse racing because my son was just up there for the season up there at Saratoga. So didn't know
I know,
if you liked the horses.
I was there for 2 years and I never went to a horse race, but the Performing Arts Center there was great. I remember
Well,
going to some great
that did it.
concerts
There,
there.
there you go. I'm sure my son wasn't there. Um, he's a handicapper for New York racing, so he doesn't get much free time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, now this is a book about your experience as being an adopted child, trying to find in your birth mother. And so, my question is, when did you first get that idea germinating in your mind? I think I want to write a book about this. And why did you write it at this time, at this age? Or did everything come together at one time?
No, I think I always wanted to write the book. I always wanted to write a book. But this was such a profound experience in my life. It was the most profound experience of my life. And I realized growing up and certainly as an adult that people didn't understand adoption. They believed the hallmark narrative of it, our cultural narrative, which says that it's just a wonderful, happy thing and everyone lives happily ever after. And that's not the truth of it. And I just was compelled to tell the adoptee's point of view. We hear so much about the wants and needs of birth parents and adoptive parents. The birth parent, needs to have they can't keep their child. They need to relinquish their child. The adoptive parents want a child, but you don't hear about what is the experience of that child in being given away from their birth family, from their heritage, from their true identity to strangers and raised with no knowledge of who they were, especially for those of us adopted during the baby scoop era of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So it was almost the center stone, the centerpiece of my life is this struggle of who am I? What am I? Where did I come from? I didn't make sense, and I was struggled with that. And I really wanted to try and communicate, write a book that not just only told the story of being adopted, but allowed readers to feel it. I want to write a very emotional story that allowed you to really inside those dark and empty, grieving feelings of an adoptee. And one of the reasons I didn't write it to this point in life is that, two things can be true at once. Adoptees can be grateful for their adoption and also have been traumatized by being adopted. And because I was a grateful adoptee and I loved my adopted parents, I didn't feel free to write this book until they had both passed away because I didn't want to hurt them. And so that's really why, for me, this book took to this point in my life to be written and published.
Okay. Well, that makes some really good sense, good common sense in why you did it at this point in time. That's very good. Wow. Well, that's interesting. Now, you said you were adopted at birth, but when did you find out about it? I don't think I may have missed it, but I thought I didn't. Was it in the book when you found out you were adopted?
Well, we never had to be told. It was just always a part of our story. And I think I said that in the book. But it was just we always knew I was adopted. There was never a big reveal. It was part of the bedtime story. How they went to the adoption agency and picked us up. So just as some children are told the stork brings them, I guess we were told that we were adopted. However, we didn't talk about what that meant or how we might feel about that. It was just simply the fact of how we came to this family.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. That's interesting. Interesting. Well, that's actually, I think that's really, really good to have it part of have it part of the whole experience and not just a big reveal and all of a sudden. Oh, by
Oh,
the
yeah.
way.
That would be shock, and I know people who have had that happen even as
Oh, yes.
adults finding out, and it devastates them. It's shocking. It takes the wind right out of their
Yeah.
knocks them to
Yeah.
their knees. Yeah.
Knocks them.
It's
Yep. No
it's
doubt about. Well, now, because you go back and we're you and I are no spring chickens anymore. So we talk about things, and you have it in your book. Did you keep diaries or journals or anything to chart your experiences, and which helped you write this book?
I did for a while in college, I kept a journal, but, I didn't really refer to that in writing. Um, it's interesting, the experiences everything in the book is absolutely factual and true. And they were just burned into my memory. I mean, they were just, moments in my life and experiences that were so vivid to me that I could write, how they felt and tasted and smelled, and, but while I always liked to write, when I was a child, I wrote more fiction and stories and made up things. And, so I wasn't really a journal writer, but I was a writer.
Mhm. You mentioned fire or burn or something like that as your last answer.
Yeah.
This leads me to an incident. This leads me to an incident. You describe an incident where your parents and when we use parents, I'm always going to mean your adopted parents.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's how I refer to them.
Okay.
Yeah.
When your parents had a bridge night and you were put in a crib and there was a fire up in your room. Tell us a little bit about that. That was sort of a bizarre occurrence.
Yeah, that was I think I was 18 months old. My parents put me to bed in my crib and very kind of naively made the mistake of they left a light on in my room on my bureau, which is right next to the crib, but tried to dim it by placing one of my little dresses on top of the light. and they went out and started their bridge game, and heard me crying during disrupting the game, and so they tried to ignore it. Then at one point, my mother got up and slid the pocket door to the hallway to the bedrooms shut so they wouldn't be disturbed by my crying. And finally, my crying became so intense and overwhelming that my father went to check on me and found that the dress had caught fire and my bureau was on fire. The top of my bureau was on fire, and I was standing in the crib screaming, because there was a fire raging right next to me. So I'm told that he took glasses of water from the bathroom sink to put the fire out, and that was the end of the story. But I never heard what happened. Like, so then what happened? Did they hold me? Did they take me to the bridge game? Did they continue the bridge game? It doesn't
Yeah.
sound like the party stopped. It sounded like they put the fire out and everyone went back to doing what they wanted to do.
Wow.
But
That's
yeah,
a terribly traumatic thing.
yeah, I think there's some kind of fear of fire back
Mhm.
in my
Yeah.
subconscious. For that, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Now you mentioned that early on you had this hole in your heart or soul, or I forget how you exactly phrase it, about because you didn't know your birth mother. How about your siblings? Did they have similar feelings? What was their
You know,
experience like?
we didn't talk about it when we were growing up. Again, I don't know if it's the times or the family that we were raised in, but we didn't really share the experience of being adopted. Although, as we got older, certainly my younger sister and I spoke about it. I never spoke to my brothers about it and didn't think they did, but was recently told by my younger brother that he and my older brother talked about it often. And so, but yeah, I think it's very universal for adoptees to feel like you have a big black hole at your center. It's just empty. There's something missing. There's this fundamental connection to life and to the world that is gone. And when your whole heritage and background is sealed and taken from you in 40 states in the United States, our birth records are still sealed, including mine in the state of New Jersey, which still says that I'm not entitled to know my origin, my family of origin, or my origin story. And so when that's taken from you and everything about you is hidden, and my adoptive parents' names are on my birth certificate, but they didn't bear me. And I love them, and I had a perfectly wonderful family growing up, but I still had this it's a very primal, it's it's something that's hard to describe, but you feel other. When you are in a family that's not your clan and not your kin, you feel the difference. But if you don't talk about it, if it's not acknowledged, you don't know what's wrong with you. And you assume it's just something wrong with you because it's a very real but very hard to define feeling of being other and something very fundamental and primal missing in your life. And I think the urge in adoptees to find their birth mother is an urge to go back and try and connect and feel for a moment, even that feeling of belonging and connection and wholeness. Um, my husband once used this phrase that I think is so well. He said, that the dying soldier on the battlefield cries out for his mother. I mean, there is something so primal about that connection. And when you never had that, when you've been taken from your mother at birth for any reason, but particularly adoption, and never get to reconnect with her, um, there's something very fundamental and primal missing in your life, and you just feel that.
Okay. And so everybody's aware time frame wise, you were adopted back in the 1950s.
Yes.
And I think everything was closed in all 50 states. Is that the case?
It probably, yeah, I don't know of any in the 1950s that were open,
Okay.
and like I said, still 40 states,
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
record's still still.
Now, as you go out and about, you talk to people, you talk to book groups, you may have goes to maybe bookstores. Are you finding other adoptees who are coming up to you and say, "Hey, that's like my story. I feel the same way." Are you connecting
Abs
with people?
Absolutely. I mean, oh my gosh, the stories I've heard and the connection, and also through social media, not only my own social media, people reaching out, but as I am watching and looking and participating in other social media, there is a huge movement out there. There's really a community out there of adoptees who are really speaking up and saying, this is the truth of adoption. Love is not enough. It's wonderful, but it is not everything we need to be whole and integrated and intact human beings. Adoptees have over 4 times the suicide rate of the normal population. And that is even come into question lately because they said that 4 times rate was based on the reports of adoptive parents talking about their adoptees not going directly to the adoptees. The rate is likely much higher than that. Adoptees are also well overrepresented in hospitalizations for both, mental health and addiction, and also in the penal institutions. So this is a trauma that adoptees experience, but that society feels we should only feel gratitude. And so people are really now speaking out online, and everywhere they can, saying that is not the truth of what it's like to be adopted. And we need to talk about it so that we can do it better going forward. And also that I think we all understand more what some of the really powerful elements are in shaping ourselves, in forming a self, and in being an intact human being, and identity and family and connection and loss. They're all such important factors for everybody.
Yeah. Well, now you talked about your family, and they were a good family, they were good providers, and yet there was a disconnect with your mother, and that was interesting. The public mother versus the private, well, the public teacher, I guess, versus the private mother. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, my adopted mother, again, my mother, was a brilliant woman, very successful, had multiple degrees, doctorates and multiple master's degrees, and was an ordained minister late in life, and just spent her life in service to others in the community. Did a lot of community work and service, and loved teaching and being a minister. But she never should have been a mother. She just didn't have she loved her work and her study and her too much, and I think she was pretty narcissistic, I think, but in not in a vain way, but more in an intellectual way and an accomplishment way. And children were messy and complicated, and disrupted your life, and it just didn't suit her well. But being the 1950s, being uh, an achieving and admired woman, you really had to have children, and so my parents adopted 4 of us, and she didn't enjoy that work, and so she was to the public face was this tireless public servant and teacher and minister who people just were so grateful for. That at home she was very impatient and cross, and she yelled all the time, and she wasn't warm, and like I said, I don't think any of us remember ever getting a hug, by being hugged by her or held by her. So it was very hard to reconcile that in as growing up. The woman that people talked to me about, how grateful they were for my mother, and the woman that we lived with, who was just a very angry, exhausted woman.
Wow, wow. You a couple things out of that. One, you tell a story where your mother and ice skating, because behind your
Yeah.
house was, I guess, a lake, and she
Yeah, it
loved to
was
go out
yeah,
there
yeah.
by herself, and it's like that's where she had her freedom.
Yeah, she liked doing these outside of the house. So, ice skating in the winter, swimming in the summer, uh, you know, doing all the work that she did for various charities and nonprofits. She really thrived when she was out of the house. She was also very athletic, and so doing physical things gave her great pleasure. And so, yeah, swimming, ice skating, skiing. She was very athletic.
Okay. And then on the other side, the difference, that's a temperament difference. Um, you talk about when she would come home from work and you were up in your room doing homework, but she would be coming in the driveway. To explain to us what happened.
Yeah, mom was so worn out by the time she got home from teaching on the days that she was teaching down at Montclair University, where she taught, that she would, uh, and she wouldn't often have lunch because she'd be serving her students. She'd give up her lunch hour to give extra attention and time to the students. So by the time she got home, she was exhausted and hungry and grouchy. And uh, so she would drive down the driveway, and instead of getting out of the car and opening the garage door, we didn't have automatic garage door openers then. Um, she would just honk the horn and expect one of us kids to come out and open the door for her. And I was usually the only one home, or the only one that listened and heard it. And so I'd run the length of the house and, really fast to get down there and run downstairs and out into the garage and like throw up the door so that she could drive. And it always took longer than she expected. She was always kind of angry and exhausted and tense and didn't seem to appreciate it. It was just sort of demanded that we do that. It took her longer to sit and wait for one of us to come and do that
Hmm.
than if she got out of there. But she was just exhausted. She just couldn't do
Yeah.
it. And then she came in and cooked dinner and she hated cooking dinner. So
Yeah.
it was
Wow.
not a good time of day for her.
No, no. Now you're growing up, and you talk to your parents, and they talk to you about things. Did you ever go to see any therapists or any support groups, or were there even support groups back then? I don't know.
I don't think so. I think again, we're talking about the 1950s and 60s, and adoption was just wonderful. It was just the adopted parents were always saviors or saints. They were and adoptees should be grateful for being in a family with two parents and a roof over their head. And I don't know that there was a narrative in which there was grief and loss and emptiness in adoptees. Now, I did start having panic attacks at about age 11 or 12, and they were profound and just terrifying to experience. And so I did go and see a therapist for a short period of time in high school, junior high school, I guess it would have been. Um, we never spoke about adoption. Adoption was not part of the narrative. It was not, there was never correlation in growing up between being adopted and having these odd, disconnected, untethered, terrifying feelings of loss and grief and emptiness. So um, at that point in time, the therapy that I received didn't help and was not in any way, shape, or form connected to being adopted.
All right. Well, now, were you ever encouraged or discouraged by your parents to go find your adopted mother? I mean, your birth mother.
Yeah. No, they encouraged us. They said, "Oh, you should search if you'd like to." I mean, they had actually sat on the board of the adoption agency at one point. I mean, they had adopted 4 children from the same agency, and so they said you should search. But just like any child, you can read between the lines of what your parents say to you. And I also got the message at the same time that yes, you can search but that'll hurt us very much if you do. So yeah, there was what they said and how they acted were two different things. And so I definitely got the message, like most adoptees do, that adoptive parents are very insecure and they really aren't strong enough to tolerate you finding and perhaps connecting to your birth parents and leaving them is sort of the implication. And so there's not a great understanding that finding your biological family and making that connection has nothing to do with how good or bad your adoptive parents are or whether you love them or not. It's about finding out who you are and being able to form a sense of self and integrate yourself. And so that is that's the primary need for that. And adoptive parents aren't educated to that. So it's something they just, I think, unconsciously feel very threatened by. So the words are, but yeah, but the actions and the feelings especially are another thing.
So they too would benefit from possibly therapy or support groups, something they could go to talk about what they're experiencing as an adopted parent.
Yeah, I think there is loss and grief and disconnection on every side of the adoption. We used to call it the adoption triangle, but now the adoption constellation. And adoptive parents, I think, would find relief in knowing that this disconnect that they're also feeling with their child, something, it's not maybe the full experience expected from parenting, or it's confusing or they don't understand their child. They are raising someone else's child. It's not their child. And so I think knowing that might relieve this sense and being able to understand that they can be loved and appreciated and have a strong connection as an adoptive parent and an adoptee, but they have to acknowledge the reality that this child they're raising is not of them. They don't have the same interests or reactions or into instincts and even things like humor and taste and all sorts of things. So I think by recognizing the differences in adoption and the things that aren't real in that sense, would free them up to be more relaxed and make room for the fact that there is another family in their home, and that's the birth family.
Well, and imagine with your parents had 4. Oh my word. That was a lot of different people, a lot of different emotions, a lot of different backgrounds and everything. It's had to be tough on them too.
Yeah, it's very confusing, and I think, you know, and as I put in the book, there was time when my mother said to my best friend's mother, my older brother was a real rebel, and that's common also in adoption. Adoptees often take one of two have one of two reactions. One is to be a rebel and test the waters and push the boundaries and
Mhm.
see if this family is going to reject them as well. Or the other one is to be the perfect child and try and make sure that there's no reason to be rejected, which I think I tried to be that. My older brother was the rebel, and he was always pushing the boundaries and acting out. And at one point, my mother said, and my mother and father, who are both very straight shooter, very, A+ students, did everything right all the time, wonderful people. Mom said, well, at least we can take comfort in the fact that he's not really ours. And
Mhm.
so I think that
Yeah,
those
that
things
hurts.
exist in adoption, but
Yeah,
but that's the reality. And I think when it's not recognized and not talked about, it's so much more painful and confusing.
no doubt. Now, you mentioned just previously, you mentioned you start getting some panic attacks, and you write about a few of them. Uh, One when I know you were going down to Williamsburg, one you were going up, I think, to New Hampshire or Vermont, and then another one out in Wyoming. Were these all related, do you think, to what the adoption and the separation? Could you explain that?
Yeah, I think a couple things have absolutely. I think they're related to being adopted and separation, but also I think clearly my body had a penchant for that. That I was just sort of wired to have huge bursts of adrenaline in anxious situations. I think it was also a cumulative effect where from the time I was born or I was conscious, I had words to put to my thoughts. I was anxious and scared and worried, and felt untethered and alone and lost. And I lived with that every day. And those are very intense and very primal feelings. And so I was stressed my whole life. I was living in a perpetual state of stress, and that wears you down. And then, if you have a penchant for something like this, then it's going to come out. And it came out in spades. And it was this living with chronic anxiety and there's just feeling of being lost and alone and just I didn't make sense. I didn't know who I was. Where did I come from? I felt so other, and I felt this big black hole in me, and yet it didn't make sense. I had perfectly fine parents. I was in a great home. Like, what was wrong with me? And so I think it's the combination of those two things. And the trauma of adoption can manifest differently in people. I mean, I have siblings who turn to drugs and alcohol, and others who just go into that state of denial and compensating and covering up. And so the trauma is there in everyone. How it is expressed is very different. And when it's expressed, there are people that spend their whole lives denying it, suppressing it. I had a woman speak to me recently at a book signing, and she told me that her mother in her 90s on her deathbed was speaking to this woman who's her daughter to say, I am so sorry, so regret that I never searched for our real family. And I want you to do that when I'm gone. And so it's a woman on her deathbed that is finally acknowledging and having to try and come to terms with this great loss. And it's it seems to come to everybody at some point in their life. Sometimes it's something other crisis or health issue that triggers it, but it's there and everyone and how you deal with it, how you face it, when you face it, and how that's manifested. Just like everyone deals with trauma differently.
Mhm. Oh, wow. That's interesting. I was feeling bad for your husband. He gets a watermelon and wants to crack it open and, "No, not here, not here, we can't do that."
No, yeah,
I was
he was so supportive and understanding of me from the get
Yeah.
go. When before I really understood what was going on in me, but he was. I had a real support, real champion in him, and I am so grateful.
He comes off as a real champion too. He must be a really great guy, it seems like.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, he
Great.
is, and he's very understanding of these issues. I think
Mhm.
he also grew up in a household where there was a lot of stuff to deal with, and I think he brought that. that sensitivity and that patience, certainly to our
Yeah.
marriage as
Yeah. Well, that's great. Now, uh, you got married. Your husband's name is Rick. Did you ever consider yourself adopting a child?
no. I would have been distraught had I had to adopt. As a friend of mine said, those of us who are adopted don't wish this on anybody. And I would not have wanted to adopt. I would have been really hard for me to adopt. I know what pain it is. I know the trauma it brings. I I didn't want to raise a traumatized child. And and yet at the same time, I can totally understand how you could take and someone's child and love it as your own. I mean, if a stranger walked in here today and handed me a child, I would take it and love it and raise it. And yet, what you don't understand, when you love someone so much that you feel like they're your child and you've given them everything and you love them so deeply, that is not enough to heal the pain and trauma and grief and loss that they've experienced. And so you have to acknowledge that, so that it's a thing. It's part of this situation. And it's hard to understand when you're only looking through the lens of being the parent, because you love so much and you're given so much. And that's wonderful and that's helpful, but it's not everything and it's not enough by itself.
Okay. Now, imagine then, and I think we're getting into a really interesting time because we're seeing more and more interracial adoptions. We're seeing many more international adoptions. Are you finding any of these people? Are they coming to you when on your book tours and everything?
I have spoken with a number of both interracial and international adoptees. I don't know a lot about it. I haven't certainly experienced that myself. But even back when I was researching adoption, I did a independent study on it at Colgate University and wrote a paper on it. So that was limited resources back then in the 1970s. But what I had certainly did talk about interracial and international adoptions at the time. And I remember thinking, "Oh my gosh, all they have lost in addition to their authentic identity, but their culture." And so again, in this huge online community that there is, and there are adoptees, there also seem to be sort of silos within that community of there, Korean American adoptees and Chinese American adoptees and interracial adoptees and all sorts of subgroups within that larger community. And people are talking and people are speaking their truth and they're saying it. And it's a very painful thing to have been not only removed from your authentic family and your authentic identity and your heritage, your biological heritage, social heritage, emotional heritage, but your culture. You're being raised in a completely different culture. And that is such loss. And that's so difficult. And again, you're dealing with a society who thinks you should only be grateful, and they're judging that gratitude on whether your family had a roof over their heads and two parents who are employed, or you had enough meat. They aren't looking at the emotional connections that you lost and the sense of self and the heritage coming through. And so it seems like, I mean, I had the best of all worlds. I was a, white baby adopted into a white family. They were a fine family. I had a good life, and I was still traumatized by adoption. So I can only imagine the trauma and grief and loss of those that were adopted into horrible families or were abused in their families or also lost their entire culture and cultural identity. I mean, we have got to talk about this because we have got to understand it. We've got to do better. We are again over four times the suicide rate and the mental health and the appeal. This is something we have to recognize. We have to change it. We have to do better.
Okay. Tell us about your experience of the adoption agency because you went a couple times to them. Good, bad. What? How? Explain that to us, please.
Well, I ended up having a very good experience with them in more recent years. But when I was in college, I wrote and asked the agency to give me any non-identifying information they could have, like who am I, where did I come from, what do my parents look like, why was I given away, and that was in the 1970s, obviously. And the letter I got back was very scrubbed. It was very polite. It was very. They actually did give me some basic information. Your parents were of Irish descent, and your mother had blue eyes and blonde hair. Your father had brown hair. they gave me some information, not, a place, and it was everything. Oh, your mother was mature and she did this in your best interest, and it just sounded lovely. Oh, there's no
Mhm.
disease, there everything's fine.
Mhm.
And there was a tone in it of, you don't need to know this stuff. It's not important. Why are you even asking? And but I was grateful for that. I mean, it was something. At least it made my parents seem like they were real people out there and not just some figment of my imagination. Um, but it certainly was very well scrubbed, and that was the narrative back then. Uh, they didn't show any importance to your biological heritage, and so later, years later, more recently, when I discovered that the agency actually was trying to connect adoptees and their biological parents if both sides agreed, it was something that they started doing a few years after I'd written them my letter. And when I reached out then and connected with them, it was a great experience. The social worker I worked with, Gloria, was wonderful. She was understanding. She was great in her direction and her education and her help. And I was so pleased to find out that my agency actually bought my book for their lending library, which I think was very brave of them because I speak truthfully about them and my experience with adoption. And yet I think certainly in that agency, as Gloria has said, they are handling things differently now. They do tell the birth mother to speak to the baby in utero and tell them that she won't be able to be with them, and they encourage their adoptive parents to recognize the birth parents and talk about that with the child. But it was wonderful. Gloria said when she read my book that she thought it went deeper than any book she'd ever read, and that it should be required reading for everyone in the
Good.
field. So I was very
Great.
touched by.
It
Yeah.
is. Now, in your journeys, you were trying to find your birth mother, and lo and behold, the first one you found was your natural father. How'd that come about?
Well, that came about because the agency, so the protocol for reuniting parents and adoptees and birth parents was you wrote a letter to them saying why you wanted to meet them. As if there was a question about that. But anyway, this is the protocol. And then they would search and find. So they found my birth mother and reached out to her, and she refused to meet me. And that was very painful. And I didn't understand it at the time. I was in my 50s. I didn't need anything from her. I just wanted to meet her, and she refused. And I couldn't understand how. I understood what I read all the books. I could understand what it was like to have a child out of wedlock in the 1950s, and I appreciated her sensitivity there. But could have met her privately and out of the home. And anyway, she refused to meet me, and I was devastated. And the agency said, "Well, we have your birth father's name," which was unusual because back then the birth father's signatures were required. He didn't know he had fathered me, and I did know that from that letter I'd received in college. They had said at the time, she never told your biological father that she was pregnant. She had left town and just never went back. So when they asked if I wanted to meet my biological father, I thought, well, I don't know. This guy doesn't even know he fathered me. You know, he, what can a 75-year-old guy, he doesn't even know. I was always thinking about my birth mother. And, but then I realized, well, maybe I could get some medical information. Maybe I could learn something more about because I'm always filling out on both my kids' medical forms and my own, unknown, unknown, unknown. So, um, I they reached out to him and, he was sitting home one night. He was a retired New York State trooper, and he's sitting home watching Jeopardy and gets a phone call that he has a daughter, a grown daughter that would like to meet him. And, he said, well, I think the first thing he said, call me back tomorrow. I mean, he wanted to make sure it was a prank. So he wanted to, authenticate the agency and all that. And but when they called him back the next night, he said, "If she has my blood, she's my daughter. Of course I wanna meet her."
Yeah,
So
that's
that
great reaction, wasn't it? Wow.
yeah, it was.
Now,
And
how many children did he have? How many half brothers, I don't know how you would call them.
yeah,
Do you have from your father?
yeah, so I have my birth father had 3 children when he married,
Mm.
and my birth mother had 5 children when she
Oh
married.
my.
So,
Okay.
there are
Wow.
8 half siblings out there.
All right. So now your mother doesn't want anything to do with you, didn't want to contact you. Your father was very happy, but eventually you do get to your mother. Now, how did you get to find your mother and
Well,
have her
my
meet you?
my birth father, told me who she was, and
Okay.
of course, had pictures, and they had dated for 2 years in high school. So he brought the yearbook to our first meeting and showed me pictures, and, I shared the story of who she was, and that's how I discovered who she was, and she actually
Hmm.
lived not far from me in New Jersey, and,
Wow.
uh,
Uh,
so yeah.
But now you didn't right? Didn't you have to go through her children to get to her to finally to agree
Yeah.
to meet you?
Yeah, she refused to meet me for 5 years. I mean, I not only through the agency,
Wow.
but then I'd write to her sort of once a year thereafter, and she just wouldn't even respond. She just didn't want anything to do with me. And I finally got mad. Friends had given me I love Joan Didion and her writing, and, uh, Blue Nights had recently come out, and friends gave me a copy, and I was reading it, and I got really angry. I got angry with some of the things Joan was saying about her adopted daughter, Quintana, and who had met her biological family. And I thought a lot of Joan's comments were just very representative of the insecurity of adoptive parents, and I just got mad. And so I thought, I am gonna reach out to my siblings on Shirley, my birth mother's side, and I just did it sort of in an angry moment. I wrote this letter saying who I was and including photographs of myself, and sent it off overnight to all 5 siblings so that they would all get it at the same time. And then I didn't know what. I thought, she hasn't want I bet they're not gonna wanna meet me either. They're gonna feel I'm an interloper. They're not gonna believe, I just thought she raised them. They're probably not gonna want anything to do with me. And yet the very next day, I had a phone call from one of my sisters saying, "Hello, Janet. This is your sister, Diane." So they were shocked, and she had not been a great mother, and but the fact that she could have denied me for so long and been so cold to me, um, blew their minds, and just what was even more appalling to them. But they were all wonderful. They welcomed me with open arms, and I really am I'm still close to them, and I'm so
Yeah.
appreciative of that.
Okay, good. That's because that's one of the questions. Are you close to the 3 from your father and the 5 from your mother? Are you guys all still
Yeah.
close?
Yes, in fact, like one of my sister Diane, who is the one to first call me, she and I talk all the time. She comes and visits me on Nantucket, and then on my father's side, my brother and sister and their families come to visit me in Nantucket all the time. So it's yeah, I'm very blessed to have them
That's
in my
great.
lives, and I see the the power. It is amazing the power of nature. It's not there's no debate in my mind. Is it nature? Is it nurture? It's nature. I mean, it is incredible the things not only I have in common with them, but my children, how they move and walk and talk, and it is just amazing to me to finally make sense in the world because I finally see the people I come from. I see my clan, my people. I make sense, and it's been wonderful.
And your kids said, "Oh my god, look at all my aunts and uncles. Holy moly." They have a huge extended family now also. Think
Yes, yeah.
about it. Wow.
Yeah,
Isn't that
my
great?
husband laughed that he has lots of sets of in-laws.
Yeah.
So,
That's okay. That's fine. Now you're 61 when you meet your mom. If I've done the math right, you're around 61, your
yeah,
mom's around 80. She still wasn't too keen to get
no,
close to you, if I'm not mistaken. No.
she just couldn't go through the so my siblings sort of shamed her into it, forced her into meeting me, and we did meet, but she was very cold and very reserved, and she just couldn't get over the shame, and she just couldn't allow me in. She just couldn't. And that hurt. It really did hurt. But I learned so much. I'm so grateful that I met her. I could see myself in her, and I could understand myself physically better. But I also tell people, you have to take everything, the good and the bad. And just like for people born into a biological family, you don't get to only be born into a family that has no problems. Every family has problems. Every family has, you know, addiction issues or mental health issues or anger. There's no family is perfect. And so just like that, adoptees, we can handle the truth and we need the truth. And when I met my mother, I saw traits that I know I have in myself that I think of as very minor issues in me. that were rampant in her. And I went, oh my God, don't let that take over. Like that's a thing, that's part of you. And so, you have to have, she was a good cautionary tale for myself, but I also understood myself so much better having met her, even though she just kept rejecting me. And the oddest thing is being around her physically, my body felt more at peace and more at ease than ever. It felt like it was home. At the same time, she was emotionally rejecting me and keeping me at arm's length. So it is this physical connection that we have to family, and this physical part of our identity is so profound, and we don't talk about it, we don't recognize it. But when you don't have it and then you find it, you realize how powerful it is, and that I could feel so physically at peace around my biological mother
Mhm.
while being emotionally rejected by her was a fascinating and very confusing
Yeah.
experience, but I'm
Yeah.
but I'm
Yeah.
grateful I was able to have it.
Wow. Couple philosophical questions for you. If you don't have the one to answer them, that's fine with me. But question: Does does you or your adoptees' right to know your birth parents supersede their right to want privacy? Where do the
Absolutely.
two meet? They do.
Absolutely.
Okay.
The desire for birth parents for privacy in our lifetime comes from a culture of shame. It's a social construct, and it's just because they're embarrassed. Well, now, especially now in 2024, we don't feel that way anymore. We don't stone women who have babies out of wedlock. I mean, it's not important anymore. And yet, the impact of having a hidden identity for the adoptee is so profound. It is changes their whole course of their life. And they grow up under such conditions of trauma and grief and loss. There's no comparison in my mind to
Mhm.
what you ask of a child to hand them to strangers.
Mhm.
Is that loss and their trauma and what they have to try and manage in their lives and cope with, that has it's no, so imbalanced with simply someone being embarrassed that they had a child out of wedlock. To me, there's no contest there.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Let's go one more. Uh, what about if it's reversed and you have no desire to find your birth mother, and the birth mother now wants to find you out of the blue? How's that going to make you feel?
Well, I've known people that that's happened to, and it's always difficult. There's no part of being adopted and living your life that's not going to be hard. And if you're not ready for that and it happens, I'm sure that's another difficult thing to go through. But that's your reality. And you're going to have to, just like everything in your life, when the reality of your life, anything that's difficult, you can either accept it or you can run from it. And you're going to pay the consequence of either of those actions at some point up the line. So I'm sure that's a difficult thing to face if you're not ready for it and it happens to you. But and maybe it was meant to happen, maybe it needed to happen. Maybe you need to face that reality and incorporate it because you can integrate those realities into your life. You need to learn to integrate yourself as who you are biologically and who you were as an adoptee. And that's just hiding from that is not going to change your reality. But I think also I say to everyone, I got lots of help. I got lots of therapy as an adult that was very helpful to me. And I read everything I could and I studied adoption. So if something like that happens to you when you're not ready for it, get help and you can work through it. But I think it's always better to know what's real than to pretend something's not real.
Good. All right. Very good. Well, now what's next? What's coming up for Janet? You're going to do books tours. You're going to be start maybe going to start support groups. What are you going to do next?
Well, I've been touring around. I've been doing a lot of speaking engagements and podcasts and interviews, and it's like I said, very gratifying to have the conversations we're having. And I'm writing. I love to write. I think I'd like to try fiction next. We'll see. I'm starting a workshop next week actually on fiction writing because I haven't done it in a long time and like to see where that takes me. I'm certainly not qualified. I'm an author. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a social worker, so I'm not qualified to do support groups. But I'm certainly happy to speak with or talk with any and share my story and share my book. But I hope my contribution to the conversation is this book, and that when people read it and feel it, that their eyes are opened and their hearts and minds are open to adoptee rights and to trying to change the conversation in our society and our culture about identity and loss and grief in adoption.
Good luck on whatever you're going to be doing. You have been wonderful. We have learned a whole heck of a lot, and there's a whole heck of a lot more in this book. So thank you for joining us today, Janet, on Books and Looks. We appreciate it.
Thank you for our conversation. I appreciate it.
Well, friends, I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. I learned a lot from Janet. She comes across and is a very thoughtful person, has some interesting and fascinating views on adoption and what she went through and the downsides of the adoption. Oh, there's lots of good sides, she'll tell you that, but there's also a bit of a downside that we never think about too much, and I appreciate her talking to us about that. So what am I looking at? I'm looking at next week. Oh, we have got a book for you next week. Author Annie Reed is here. Annie Reed has a new book called The Imposter Heiress. The Imposter Heiress, a true story, nonfiction story. We're going back to the Gilded Age in Ohio, when we're going to meet one Cassie Chadwick. Boy, I tell you, you talk about a person who had cons going on everywhere. This girl, she took the everything. She was taken from everywhere. She conned people out of loads and loads of money. She was an imposter. You're going to find out about that. It's really a fascinating story. You don't want to miss that. That's coming up next week on Books and Looks. So anyway, on behalf of my website, viewsonbooks.com, on behalf of my good friends at Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks, saying may all your leaves be pages in a book. Bye-bye.